Western imagination of Islam has always had the woman question at its core, which has been a key component of criticisms of Islam within the Western world. According to Mahmoud, a long colonial history has shaped the essential framing of rationalizing itself on the basis of inferiority of the non-Western cultures. In other words, since colonialism, the West has classified itself as modern with an us versus them mentality, where women must be rescued from the other. Bowen's article, on the other hand, discusses the difficulties of the French debate that stem from the diverse notions of what is supposed to happen in the neutral public space, and thus why it is that one must fight to preserve it. Policies were implemented to protect the French national identity in secular public space. An example of this were the scarf mediators put in place to influence girls to take off their scarves. In contrasting this to Mahmoud's book, the Dawa movement wanted to reevaluate the Muslim identity, moving away from the secular Muslim identity and towards the traditional Islamic roots. As seen throughout her book, Mahmoud points to the ways in which the Egyptian state has tried to control and manage this reinforcement of Islamic knowledge and identity as a means of maintaining its secular national identity as well. Ethics. The theme of the fourth chapter of Mahmoud's book is that of positive ethics, with an emphasis on how values are stated as well as how people live according to a particular moral code. What is more important than how people live or practice these moral norms is how people form relationships between them and their personhood. Mahmoud emphasizes the formation of the self and how one practices and creates a habit in order to change itself in accordance with these moral codes. A practice should not be practiced for the sake of religiosity, but should instead be internally adopted and real. For the women Mahmoud worked with, outward behavioral forms were not only expressions of their interiorized religiosity, but also a necessary means of acquiring it. In other words, practicing certain behavioral norms aided these practices in becoming intimate and real. Piety. The concept of piety is especially important because the desire to pray is not natural. It must be created through a set of disciplinary acts. As discussed by Mahmoud, the technique through which pious desires are cultivated include practices such as avoiding seeing, hearing, and speaking about things that make faith weaker and engaging in those acts that strengthen the ability to enact obedience to God's will. The enactment of gestures and behaviors devolves upon the spontaneous expression of well-rehearsed emotions and individual intention, thereby displaying attention to how one learns to spontaneously express the right attitude, an example being crying over prayer. Ritual is not regarded as the theater in which a performed self enacts a script of social action, but rather the space of ritual is one among a number of sites where the self comes to acquire and give expression to its proper form. Mahmoud's discussion of piety is closely related to the Church of England's idea that the external performances such as public prayer are understood to create an inward desire predispositions. In other words, the inner quality or moral virtues are developed as a result of outer practices. One may say that these practices are acquired out of habit, but Mahmoud discusses the ways in which moral cultivation of habits can lead to habitus, according to the Aristotelian model, which is very different from and should not be confused with habits. Virtuous habitus is acquired by various habits, but once habitus is acquired through diligent practice, it takes root in one's character and is considered unchangeable. In this moral cultivation, habitus implies a quality that is acquired through human industry, assiduous practice, and discipline, such that it becomes a permanent feature of a person's character. The triad of love, hope, and fear. Mahmoud discusses the triad of love, hope, and fear, with love and hope offering the promise of gaining merit or recompense from God as what inspires one to undertake religious duties, whereas the fear of God's wrath provides motivation for one to abstain from sins and vices. These emotions become constituted as motives for and modalities of pious conduct in the realization of a virtuous life. The emotion of fear does not simply serve as a motivation for the pursuit of virtue and avoidance of vice, but it enables one to know and distinguish between what is good for oneself and for one's community and what is bad. Love and fear of God are integrally linked to their ability to recognize God's greatness, both in his capacity to punish and in his capacity to forgive and sustain his creatures despite their tendency to err. Repeated invocations of fear and practices that evoke and express that fear train one to live piously and are also permanent conditions of the pious self. Agency. Mahmoud argues that instead of thinking about agency as simply a synonym for the resistance of social norms, one must see it as a modality to action that will raise interesting questions about the relationship of subjects and norms. The mosque participants do not understand the body as a sign of the self's interiority, but as a means of developing the self's potentiality. In both Holy Harlots and the Politics of Piety, the authors identify and address agency as a key component to social life and struggle. While agency is conceptualized differently in both structures, it is evident that the women in both examples act within and against the gendered norms in their societies. Transgression to agency inherently allows freedom to be understood as historically and culturally specific. In both ethnographies, agency cannot be seen as abstract, but rather should be understood as the freedom to make choices within existing structures and relations that inform and position individuals. The mosque movement allows Egyptian women to move towards piety. However, Mahmoud notes that at several points in the movement, men felt that it was a threat and went beyond the role of women in Egyptian society. However, despite these drawbacks, the women felt this was the way to obtain piety and ultimately went against the male kins. Therefore, through the mosque movement, women were able to revive Islam through virtuous practices after secular powers had forced traditional Islam practices to be lost. Similarly, in Holy Harlot, spirit possession can be seen as a way for women such as Nazaré to act freely within existing social structures. The Pamba Gira spirit that possesses her allows Nazaré to act against male kin who are close to her. For instance, the spirits constantly disrupt her daily activities to show her that both her father and husband were engaging in extramarital relationships. The spirits protected her from her abusive father and helped to encourage her husband to withdraw himself from the extramarital relationships at different times. As Hayes mentions, male sexuality is associated with the public sphere of the street. A man asserts his masculinity not only by controlling his women, but in the number of his sexual conquests. Therefore, the spirits gave Nazaré an authoritative role to control her husband's sexual activities by dropping the submissive norms women are supposed to abide by, and instead confronting him about those relationships. Ergo, the spirits allow women to have a voice in the public sphere, a place where they are traditionally dismissed.